right. Welcome back, everybody. We are in the final leg, final stretch for today. And so we've talked a lot about props. We talked about emits. And so something you might be thinking, though, is that, well, OK, it makes sense, right? I can pass data down to my components. But at some point, this might get kind of cumbersome. And so I want to kind of give you like a micro version of the button exercise that I give in the production grade view workshop. So if you want to check that out for this. But let's, for a second, think of a component. Let's go ahead and depict this out real quick as a base button. And so for this base button, you probably are thinking, well, it's a button component. And what kind of props would I want to pass to it? Well, if we think about it, we can say, well, usually you need to have some text on your button. So OK, let's call that a text prop. And then I'll do the shorthand typing right now. So this is an alternative, by the way, for props where if you don't want to do the required and default, you just pass the type directly like this. But again, generally speaking, I think it's a best practice to define whether it's required or if it's not required and has a default. Basically, do your due diligence on that. It helps your team in the long run. OK, so you're like, OK, well, there might be some text here. And then what happens if your product manager is like, you know what, I think I want to use the icons on the left-hand side. Then you're like, oh, OK. Maybe like icon left string. Or maybe just icon, right? Because you're like, oh, OK, it has an icon. It has an icon. It's going to the left. And then they go, well, actually, it depends, because the icon might be on the left or the right. And then you might start getting the hint of where I'm going with this when you're like, OK, well, icon right. And for now, I'm just keeping it simple, just keeping these strings. So it's like, OK, string. And then all of a sudden, it's like, well, I also need this to replace a loading spinner in case it's like fetching an API call. And all of a sudden, what you got here is this massive list of props for your what is really just a button component, right? Especially for something like this text here. Can you imagine how complicated the v if else if is going to be when it's like if loading shows this, but else this, but then also if there's an icon, then do this. Like this button will become very, very troublesome to manage. And so, of course, Vue has an answer for this. And the answer for this is around the idea of slots. And so slots are an interesting concept in that we have been using them this whole time when it comes to HTML. So how does a slot work? Well, let's go ahead and just show you how. Let's just refactor this real quick. So icon, let's do this. Icon text. So I just want to have something that will render on the page. And then we'll say, OK, so let's go. Actually, since this is a playground, let me move the base button to playground so that this can be consistent. Base button is going to source, going to components. There we go. Perfect. And then to keep that consistent, we'll just do base button in kebab case. We'll hide that. And then now let's make sure I'm running the playground app so we don't run the wrong one. Because nothing's more infuriating than being in the wrong environment and thinking your code's not changing. OK, so we have a base button here, app.vue. So import base button from here, base and button. And then this is supposed to be base counter. OK, how does base button work at the moment? It is base button, and we can give it a text of hi and the icon of arrow. OK, so what happened? Oh, I did not close it. There we go. OK, we see it here, right? It says arrow and hi. Great. What we want to avoid when it comes to props is being overly descriptive with how something is supposed to be used. It's useful for guidance. It's useful as a guardrail. But when it comes to something like what text belongs in a button, it doesn't often make sense to do something like that with a prop. So instead, what do? Well, there is a built-in element called slot. And so it's globally available to your app at all times because this is a Vue component. And slot, if we think about it, it actually functions just as you would expect when it comes to HTML. You just didn't realize it. So rather than being like, oh, I wanted to say arrow and then dash high, this is a base button. And we call it like a normal component. And we say arrow left and high. And if you're looking at this going like, isn't that HTML? I'd say exactly. It's just like HTML. Why complicate things beyond that, right? There are times where you just want to let people just define whatever they want inside of your component. Now, granted, eventually you could do some fancy things regarding maybe some props. Maybe there is a point where you have some base icon here, for example. But slots are one of the most powerful features of Vue in the sense that it allows for flexibility. It's almost like, in that regard, the complete opposite of props. Where props, you're being very prescriptive. Do this with this type, this is required, but do it in this place. Slots is saying, all right, I'm open. Like, you basically work with me here. And so the cool thing about slots, too, is that slots are more intelligent than like a standard HTML element in that you can actually provide it a default content. So what we can do is we can say, yeah, so we'll just call it submit by default. And so when you do that, this means that when I go ahead and delete what's inside, you'll notice it automatically falls back to that content, which, again, can be very nice for just sort of providing some conventions, especially when people start having design systems and that sort of thing. It's like, OK, most of our buttons are submit. We can go ahead and just say, OK. We can go ahead and say, OK, all base buttons have a default of submit. But otherwise, the moment someone needs to override it, easy peasy. This is no longer submit. This is now cancel. As you can see, updates, just as you would expect.
And you can bind that, obviously, to your data or? Yep,
exactly. So the question here is around, can we do more than this? Yeah, because we should treat this just like any other HTML element. So in here, we can do something like user data.name. And there you go. It just works. And I think, I don't know, that's one of the things that always excites me when I look at how Vue's API is designed is extensibility on what people already understand and then just leveraging the heck out of it. Why not? Why not sprinkle on some syntactic sugar, some superpowers that make it even easier, right? Because again, slots inherently already work from like an HTML perspective, but now you can provide like default content. And so you can even, if you think about it, sorry about that. We could even say something like, we can actually do if conditions for slots too. So if we had something like called direction, and let's say direction's here, and we say v if left, we could do slot for v else. And then, so let's say the default is actually this submit. But otherwise, if it has a configured prop of left, it might be like icon left, whatever, cancel. And so what you get here is I'm already overriding it. But if you come in here, save, you'll see that submit is falling back as we would expect. But if we have, I think my if direction doesn't make sense. Actually, I can just do left. It's fine. So I'll do left is a Boolean, and the default is false. So like that, you see submit does come up. And then we can say left is true. Icon left, cancel. So that's pretty cool. But what else can we do? There's even more. Because if we think of slots like a mailbox slot, we might want to have multiple slots on a component, not just one. And so what if we were to do something like layouts? Well, if you had a layout component, let's say, let me do base layout.view. What you're probably going to end up having is you probably have some sort of div that is your class wrapper, right? Assuming you have like a design system. But then you might want to start figuring out where things are being slotted. So for example, you might have an aside here that is class like sidebar. And then you probably have somewhere where you want to render out your main content. And then you probably have like your footer content. And so again, if you do this by traditional props and that kind of stuff, it gets really painful because how do you pass components into props? Like that's just a whole messy matter. But what we can do is we can give our slots names. So this can be the sidebar slot. This can be the main slot. And this can be the footer slot. And so the way this would work is, if we're inside of if we're inside of our app.view, we can go ahead and import base. Let's see. Let me duplicate this one, and then base layout from base layout. Reorganize that to be alphabetical. Great. Okay. Then we get our base layout. What we can do now is we can now define specific snippets of HTML to go in specific places. How do we define HTML? We have our template element. And so I know it's like, whoa, there's a template in a template. But again, if you look at MDN, template is an actual HTML element. It's a content template element. Like, this is a thing. I think a lot of people at one point was like, oh, that looks like a Vue thing. No, this is in the MDN docs. This is fairly standard. And so what we can do is we can say, look, this is the aside. And how do we tell it the template that we want to go there? Well, we do the vslot directive, and we tell it the, I believe this is aside like this. And so if this renders correctly, base layout. Oh, wait, I did not. No, that's right. OK. Base layout. Let me make sure that's working. Base layout is in playground. Wonderful. Slot. Oh, I called it sidebar. So, of course, there's nowhere to go. So I misnamed it sidebar. Aside. There we go. And so let's give this just a little bit of styling just so that we can see the difference. So let's go ahead and give the sidebar border 2px solid red. And then we'll go ahead and do the same for each one. So we'll have main, and then we'll have footer. And so we'll make this green. We'll make this blue. And so you can see right now, because nothing's being passed to the slot for main or footer, nothing's being rendered, just the aside. And so all we got to do now is we can go ahead and add like things like template, vslot main, and then I can even do things like actually render the user card. Actually, I could even just take this component right here. Let's take the user card here, and just drop it directly inside of main. And so you can see here that it's actually being rendered inside. Although, where did my borders go? Main class. Oh, I didn't give it a class. Class main. There we go. Did you have a question?
I was wondering if the components that are not the slots render in the DOM when you bring that template in.
So you're saying that if I don't...
So currently you have nothing in the footer slot.
Yep.
Is there a footer element in the
DOM? Good question. And the answer is yes, it is there. Because as far as Vue is concerned, what you're saying is this is the scaffold expected to render. There's nothing, well, yeah, I guess it would be a little bit tricky to, as far as like checking to make sure the slot, like whether the slot is empty or not. So at that point, though, I would say that if you're starting to get conditional about what content is showing inside, at that point, it would make more sense to make a slot name of a slot of footer, for example. And then maybe maybe the default is to have like some content in here, but then otherwise let someone completely override it. And then that way, if there is no slot, nothing shows up at all. That's probably the way I would approach it in that particular case. So here we go. We have that. Whoops, what did I forget? There we go. Boom. So we can see now the footer actually is rendering. And so all I got to do now is do the template vslot footer inside of here, and then let's drop the base counter in there. Boom. And so slots become really powerful because if you've ever worked with like a backend CMS where users are defining layouts, now you have the ability to, like, when you're fetching data, to actually drop things where they're supposed to go, as opposed to like having to configure like, oh, this is my 2-column layout. This is my 3-column layout. This is my 2-column with one. Like, there comes a point where like that becomes very tedious to maintain. And slots do a lot in terms of opening up a lot of reusability and composability when it comes to that. And so what's cool about what's cool about this too is that because it's programmatic in terms of assigning its property, there's no like it doesn't have to appear in a certain order. So for example, I'll just swap these to show that. You'll see that even though technically inside of here we've ordered it as like aside, main, whatever, it's totally being controlled at this level. And so as a result, you can, again, it just allows for more composability and flexibility when it comes to that. And the other thing I want to leave you off with before we dive into exercises and other questions is that if you're looking at some other code bases, not everyone writes out the vslot directive. And this is a convention within Vue 3 in that you can shorthand it to just the hashtag symbol. The way to think about it is like it's the ID of the template where you're putting your slot. Or the ID of the slot that you want to put the template stuff in. To be honest, I find it a little bit confusing because if someone doesn't know what this is and tries to Google this, sometimes they might end up with CSS stuff. Like this shorthand, personally, I don't tend to use it. Again, it is in code bases, which is why I'm telling you all this exists. So if that's your team's convention, I would say roll with it. Personally, though, I don't mind actually being explicit about slot sidebar. I think this, to me, is expressive. And personally, that's what I prefer. Does anyone have any questions in regards to slots? OK. So for your exercise, what I want you to do is basically, let me see, check out begin, git checkout branch 08 exercise. OK. Git commit feature add slot layout example. OK. So if you pull down 08 exercise, you'll be able to see all the code that I just did. I want you to go ahead on your own app, create your own base layout, play around with slots, see how you might want to rearrange things, see how that feels when you have one slot versus having multiple slots with name slots. And so basically, we'll give that for the next, to the next 10 minutes. right. How did everyone feel about playing around with slots? Good? Fairly straightforward? That is great to hear. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just basically, I'm going to take a look at the ATLA forum on my end, and we'll just do a quick one as far as that goes. So let me go ahead and check out a branch. Await solution. CD Atla. Great. Run dev. Everything should be running as expected. Yep, perfect. Okay. So when I'm looking at Atla, I'm thinking, okay, well, base component, what does a base layout look like? So I'm going to go ahead, create my base layout, .view. Inside of here, let's keep it simple. So we're just going to have the template, and all that it manages is where things are placed. So we'll actually just create basically our, let's do, how many things do we have? 4 things. All right, so let's do a div, and then we'll have here, so we'll call this class grid, and then we'll say actually this time we'll open a style block, and for grid we'll display grid and grid template columns 2 repeat 2 1 fr. Basically this will repeat 2 columns inside of this, so div, and then for now let's just go ahead and drop this to make this a slot. And then we'll say the name for this slot is 1. This will be the first one. And then we'll copy this and then just drop it in here for 2. Okay.
Do you want those to be V slots or just slots?
Oh, shoot. Yes. Autocomplete. Just slot. Thank you for catching that. Okay. Inside of our app, we're going to go ahead, grab that, and then this will be base layout. Go ahead and copy that, base layout. Then we'll actually call it here. And this time in base layout, we'll go ahead and let's take our new character down here. So I think that's all of this stuff. And then let's just drop that in the first slot to start. So where are we here? Okay, so we'll have the template here, dropping in the new character, and the V slot we're looking for is 1. So if you save that, you'll see that we're actually, I guess let me show this so that it's a little bit clearer. PyPX solid green. Actually, what's a fun? Papaya whip. Love that one. Let's do it. Okay, not very accessible though. I like the name. Okay, so we can see here that that is showing up on the left-hand side, and then all we need to do if we want to swap it, for example, is just do V slot 2, and you can see it jumps from left to right. And so that's just like a simple implementation of a possible grid, and you can imagine when you start combining this with CSS, slotting stuff around, you get some pretty powerful stuff when it comes to responsive design as well. So yeah, let me actually commit this code before I forget. Feature add layout for Atla form. Okay. All right. So in terms of closing thoughts for today, how's everyone feeling in terms of like the material? Do you have any questions about what we've gone through? Anything that sticks out? I'll let you rummage for a bit. Okay. Okay, so today we covered a lot of the foundational pieces, right? I went through some of the essentials as far as like what you need to get up and running with Vue very quickly. We saw what a progressively enhanced migration strategy might look like for an enterprise client. But now going forward, starting tomorrow, we're going to be diving pretty heavily now into all project-based things. So we're talking state management. We'll be talking about routing. We're talking about how to share like composables. We're talking about composition API. So tomorrow, you know, as you start thinking about it, bring any sort of additional Vue 3 questions. If you have anything that comes up from today that you might have forgot about, feel free to bring those as well for tomorrow. But otherwise, really appreciate having everyone here for day 1 and looking forward to tomorrow.